The afternoon sun cast dappled shadows through the ancient oak's branches as St. Mary Mead gathered for its annual harvest festival. Miss Jane Marple sat quietly on her customary bench, knitting needles clicking softly while her keen eyes observed the familiar choreography of village life. The great tree, centuries old and witness to countless gatherings, presided over tables laden with preserves and handicrafts, its massive trunk scarred by time and weather. Mrs. Dolly Bantry swept between the stalls with theatrical authority, her silk scarf fluttering as she directed volunteers with the precision of a military commander. "The jam table must catch the morning light properly," she declared, though the afternoon was already well advanced. Near the oak's base, Colonel Melchett discussed arrangements with Dr. Haydock, their voices occasionally rising above the general bustle. Miss Marple noticed how the colonel's hands trembled when he thought himself unobserved. Age came to them all, though some fought it more fiercely than others. The arrival of Victoria Ashford created a subtle stir among the volunteers. She emerged from her gleaming motor car with practiced elegance, her auburn hair perfectly arranged despite the September breeze. Her husband Geoffrey followed reluctantly, his expensive London suit marking him as distinctly urban among the country tweeds. Their presence surprised many, as the couple typically avoided what Victoria had once termed provincial entertainments. Their son, Timothy, bounded ahead, his 15-year-old energy infectious as he attempted to impress Sarah Clement, the vicar's daughter, with elaborate cricket statistics. Reverend Leonard Clement himself appeared shortly after, his usually serene expression clouded with carefully controlled anxiety. Miss Marple had known Leonard since his arrival 5 years earlier, and his current agitation was therefore all the more noticeable. He moved between preparations with distracted efficiency, his responses brief and his smile forced. The formidable Mrs. Price Ridley commanded attention as always, sweeping across the green with her walking stick tapping authoritatively. "In my day, we understood proper organization," she announced to no one in particular. Her companion, the long-suffering Miss Hartnell, nodded agreement while casting apologetic glances at nearby volunteers. Most intriguing was young Dennis Clement, the vicar's nephew recently arrived from Oxford for an extended visit. At 22, he possessed confident charm combined with an intellect that had already earned university recognition. Miss Marple observed how his presence affected several younger women, though his attention seemed focused primarily on Victoria Ashford, despite their significant difference in circumstances. Dr. Haydock's wife Margaret bustled about with characteristic medical efficiency, organizing the first aid station with methodical precision. She paused occasionally to exchange pleasantries with Miss Marple about the unseasonably warm weather and promising attendance expected. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the festival reached its crescendo. Children raced between stalls, their laughter echoing off the oak's ancient bark. The coconut shy drew competitive crowds, while ladies judged preserves with serious concentration. Miss Marple's needles continued their rhythmic dance, but her attention remained fixed on the subtle undercurrents flowing through the gathering. She noticed Victoria's interactions with other women carried strain, her smile never quite reaching her eyes when speaking with Mrs. Bantry. Geoffrey checked his pocket watch repeatedly, glancing toward their motor car with obvious longing. Young Dennis moved through the crowd with easy confidence, though Miss Marple detected something calculating in his casual conversations. The moment came, as such moments do, without warning. A child's scream pierced the afternoon tranquility. Young Daisy Henderson, her pigtails bouncing as she pointed toward the oak's massive base. Her companions followed her gaze, their faces transforming from childish delight to bewildered terror. Mrs. Victoria Ashford's shriek followed immediately, raw with horror that instantly silenced the entire festival. The crowd surged forward like a tide of morbid curiosity and growing apprehension. Miss Marple, though unhurried, found herself carried along, her sharp eyes scanning faces around her, noting varying shades of shock, confusion, and something else she couldn't quite identify. Beneath the sprawling branches where moments before laughter had echoed, lay Geoffrey Ashford. He was sprawled awkwardly, his expensive London suit disheveled, a dark stain spreading across his pristine shirt. His eyes, wide and unseeing, stared up at the peaceful blue sky that now seemed utterly incongruous with the grim reality below. A small ornate letter opener lay discarded nearby, glinting innocently in the dappled sunlight. Dr. Haydock pushed through the throng, his face grave as he knelt beside the still form. His brief examination confirmed what everyone already knew. "He's gone," he announced quietly, his voice carrying to the crowd's edges. "Someone call Constable Davies." The words, though expected, solidified the horror. A murder here, in St. Mary Mead, beneath the very symbol of its enduring peace. The idyllic afternoon had shattered, replaced by the chilling realization that darkness could creep into the brightest days. Miss Marple remained on her bench, a quiet sentinel, her mind already beginning to sift through the sudden, brutal disruption. The sun still shone, but its warmth now felt cold and distant. The silence that followed Dr. Haydock's pronouncement hung heavy over the festival grounds, broken only by the rustle of autumn leaves and Victoria Ashford's muffled sob. Within minutes, the clatter of bicycle wheels announced Constable Davies's arrival, his usually cheerful face now grave with the weight of unprecedented responsibility. St. Mary Mead had seen its share of minor infractions, but murder was entirely beyond his experience. "Nobody leaves," Davies announced, his voice steadier than his trembling hands as he surveyed the scene. "I'll need statements from everyone present." He approached the body with visible reluctance, producing a handkerchief to carefully lift the ornate letter opener without disturbing potential evidence. The weapon gleamed in the afternoon light, its elaborate silver handle catching the sun with almost mocking brightness. Mrs. Bantry immediately assumed command of crowd control, her natural authority asserting itself in crisis. "Form an orderly line by the tea tent," she directed, wrapping a protective arm around Victoria's shoulders. "Come away, my dear. You shouldn't see any more of this dreadful business." Victoria allowed herself to be led away, though her eyes remained fixed on her husband's still form with an expression that might have been shock, grief, or something else entirely difficult to interpret. Young Timothy Ashford stood frozen, his boyish enthusiasm completely evaporated. Sarah Clement, the vicar's daughter, reached instinctively for his hand, her own face pale with the kind of innocent terror that comes from witnessing violence for the first time. Dennis Clement, by contrast, observed the proceedings with scholarly detachment, his university education apparently providing some buffer against the immediate horror. "Dreadful business," muttered Colonel Melchett as he strode across the green, his military bearing evident in every step. His experienced eye took in the scene like a battlefield assessment. "Dr. Haydock, what can you tell us about the wound?" "Single thrust, quite precise," the doctor replied quietly. "Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. The blade went straight to the heart." Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her sharp eyes catalogued every reaction, every whispered comment, every subtle shift in the crowd's dynamics. She noticed how Dennis positioned himself to maintain visual contact with Victoria, how Mrs. Price Ridley's walking stick tapped with increased agitation, and how Reverend Clement's hands shook whenever his gaze fell upon the body. "Anyone recognize this letter opener?" Davies asked, holding up the weapon with careful reverence. Several villagers leaned forward to examine it, though none immediately claimed knowledge of its origin. "Victorian craftsmanship," Dennis observed with academic interest. "Quite valuable, I'd say. Not the sort of thing one would expect at a village festival." Mrs. Price Ridley's voice cut through the murmurs with characteristic authority. "In my day, such things simply didn't happen in respectable villages. Mark my words, there's something unsavory about this whole affair. People like the Ashfords. Too much money, too little character, they bring their troubles with Them. Really, Mrs. Price Ridley. Reverend Clement protested weakly, though his own troubled expression suggested similar thoughts had crossed his mind. Miss Marple's attention focused on young Daisy Henderson, who had discovered the body. The child stood clutching her mother's skirt, still pointing toward the oak with trembling finger. "What made you look there, dear?" Miss Marple asked gently, her voice carrying no more excitement than if she were inquiring about the weather. "A bird," Daisy whispered, "making a funny noise, like when you clean plates and the cloth squeaks." Her childish observation sent a small chill through Miss Marple, who filed the detail away for future consideration. Dr. Haydock approached Davies with additional observations. "There's remarkably little blood on the weapon itself, Constable. Rather curious, considering the extent of the victim's wounds." This technical detail sparked fresh whispers among the gathered villagers, each person adding their own interpretation to the growing web of speculation. Victoria's grief, while genuine, struck several observers as oddly composed. Margaret Haydock, with her medical training, attended to the new widow with professional efficiency. "She's handling the shock remarkably well," she murmured to her husband, though her tone suggested this observation raised as many questions as it answered. Timothy suddenly broke away from Sarah's comforting presence, his young voice cracking with anguish. "Father was supposed to take me fishing tomorrow morning. He promised we'd try the new spot upstream." The simple statement carried more emotional weight than any dramatic outburst, reminding everyone that behind the mystery lay genuine human loss. As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the festival's abandoned stalls took on an almost surreal quality, colorful displays that had seemed cheerful. Hours earlier now appeared garish against the gathering dusk. The ancient oak, witness to centuries of village life, presided over its first murder in living memory. Miss Marple's keen observation caught a detail that escaped others entirely. Near the Women's Institute stall, she noticed a green leather writing set displayed among donated items, now conspicuously incomplete. A thin piece of string still clung to the letter opener's handle, suggesting a price tag recently removed. The implications were intriguing, though she kept her observations to herself for the moment. Colonel Melchett drew Reverend Clement aside for a private consultation. "Any recent disputes involving Ashford? Business dealings that might have created enemies?" The vicar hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with turning knowledge into suspicion. He had expressed interest in purchasing the old mill property. "There's been considerable discussion about development versus preservation. Some feelings have run rather high." As Constable Davies began his preliminary questioning, the real investigation was beginning. Yet Miss Marple suspected the truth lay not in obvious motives or dramatic confrontations, but in the subtle undercurrents of village life that had been suddenly, violently exposed beneath the old oak's ancient branches. Constable Davies established his makeshift headquarters beside the tea tent, his notebook trembling slightly as he began the delicate process of questioning villagers who had never imagined themselves witnesses to murder. The festival atmosphere had transformed entirely. Cheerful bunting now fluttered like warning flags above hushed conversations and anxious glances. Miss Marple remained on her bench, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her sharp eyes catalogued every nuance of behavior around her. Mrs. Bantry took charge of practical matters, with characteristic efficiency, ensuring Victoria Ashford was provided with tea in a quiet corner away from curious stares. The widow's composure continued to impress observers, though Miss Marple detected something almost rehearsed in her careful responses to expressions of sympathy. Victoria's grief appeared genuine enough, yet it seemed filtered through layers of self-control that suggested either remarkable strength or careful preparation. "Such a dreadful shock," murmured Miss Hartnell as she attempted to restore order to the Women's Institute stall. Miss Marple approached with apparent casualness, her mild interest in the remaining items drawing no particular attention. The green leather writing set sat prominently displayed, its elegant appointments catching the afternoon light. Most significantly, a thin piece of string still dangled from where the letter opener should have rested, the price tag having been hastily removed. "A handsome donation," Miss Marple observed gently, running her fingers along the leather's smooth surface. "From the vicarage, I believe?" "Yes, clearing out cupboards for the sale," Miss Hartnell confirmed, lowering her voice instinctively. "Everything was inventoried this morning. The opener was definitely there when we opened. I priced it myself at 8:30. Miss Marple's needles paused, almost imperceptibly. "How many people examined the stall before the unfortunate incident?" "Several, actually. Mr. Burton looked over the tools, though he found them inadequate. The Ashfords strolled past but purchased nothing. Young Dennis Clement inquired about books, and Sarah helped arrange the smaller items." Miss Hartnell's recitation carried the precision of someone accustomed to keeping careful accounts. Meanwhile, Constable Davies had begun questioning Victoria about her movements during the critical period. Her initial account seemed straightforward enough. She had arrived with Geoffrey around 2 o'clock, separated to pursue different activities, and was judging preserves when the alarm was raised. However, Mrs. Price Ridley's intervention introduced the first significant crack in this narrative. "Actually, Constable," the formidable woman announced. With obvious satisfaction, Mrs. Ashford left the judging table well before the commotion began. Said she needed to check on Timothy, though the boy seemed perfectly content with young Sarah. Victoria's composure flickered momentarily. "I may have stepped away briefly. The afternoon was quite warm and I felt somewhat faint. Fresh air seemed advisable." Her explanation sounded reasonable, but Miss Marple noticed how carefully the words were chosen, each phrase measured for maximum plausibility. Dr. Haydock provided additional details that complicated the emerging picture. The wound was inflicted with considerable precision, suggesting either anatomical knowledge or extraordinary fortune. The angle indicates the attacker was approximately the same height as the victim, which unfortunately eliminates very few suspects. Young Dennis Clement approached Davies with scholarly enthusiasm. "I couldn't help noticing the letter opener's craftsmanship. Constable. The hallmarks suggest Mappin and Webb, probably from the 1880s. Quite valuable for a village sale." His expertise seemed natural enough for an Oxford history student, though Miss Marple observed how his confident demeanour shifted slightly under official scrutiny. Timothy Ashford sat apart from the adult discussions, his young face bearing the bewildered expression of someone whose world had suddenly become incomprehensible. Sarah Clement remained beside him, offering quiet comfort, while Dennis hovered nearby with protective attention that seemed to encompass both young people. Miss Marple noted how Timothy's eyes occasionally sought his mother with an expression that appeared more anxious than purely sorrowful, suggesting the boy perceived family complexities that adults preferred to ignore. Reverend Clement joined the gathering with obvious reluctance, his pastoral duties conflicting with the necessity of providing potentially damaging information. "I feel obligated to mention Geoffrey's interest in the old mill property," he told Davies quietly. "There has been considerable local opposition to his development plans. Some discussions became rather heated." Colonel Melchett nodded grimly. Ashford's business methods weren't always entirely ethical, though technically legal. He'd been pressuring old Mrs. Weatherby to sell despite her clear reluctance, made himself several enemies in the process. This revelation cast the murder in an entirely different light. Instead of a simple domestic tragedy, Geoffrey's death might represent local resistance to unwelcome change. The Preservation Society, led by Mrs. Price Ridley and including both Colonel Melchett and Dennis Clement, had obvious motive for opposing Geoffrey's plans. Miss Marple's attention was drawn to young Daisy Henderson, who had discovered the body. The child sat very still, as if stillness might make the horrible memory recede. Miss Marple approached with a gentle manner that made children trust her instinctively. "You mentioned hearing a funny sound," she said softly, "like cleaning plates with a squeaky cloth. Did it come from up in the tree or down on the ground?" "The ground," Daisy whispered. Near the big roots. Then I saw the shiny thing and thought it was treasure." Miss Marple patted the child's hand reassuringly, then glanced toward the oak's exposed roots. A faint scuff marked the soil near the trunk, not the wide trampling of curious crowds, but a neat pivot where someone had braced and turned. It was the sort of mark any experienced gardener would notice, suggesting someone had stood precisely there, perhaps bending to retrieve or conceal something. As afternoon shadows lengthened, the festival grounds took on an increasingly ominous quality. Colorful decorations that had seemed cheerful hours earlier now appeared grotesquely inappropriate above the scene of violent death. The ancient oak stood sentinel over gathering darkness, its massive trunk bearing silent witness to secrets that daylight had not yet revealed. Miss Marple walked slowly toward home, her mind organizing the afternoon's revelations like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The letter opener's provenance, Victoria's inconsistent alibi, Dennis's convenient expertise, the Preservation Society's opposition to Geoffrey's plans, and that small but significant scuff mark near the oak's roots all demanded careful consideration. Somewhere among these fragments lay the truth, waiting for patient observation to reveal its face. The morning brought Inspector Slack from Much Benham, his arrival announced by the aggressive rumble of a police motor car that scattered chickens and drew curious faces to cottage windows throughout St. Mary Mead. Miss Marple observed his entrance from her garden gate, noting how his brisk efficiency immediately transformed the investigation's atmosphere from village tragedy to serious criminal matter. Constable Davies greeted his superior with visible relief, clearly grateful to transfer responsibility for such an unprecedented case. Inspector Slack's first action was to examine the crime scene with methodical thoroughness, his experienced eye cataloging details that had escaped initial observation. The scuff mark near the oak's roots caught his attention immediately, and he spent considerable time measuring distances and angles with professional precision. "Deliberate positioning," he muttered to Davies, loud enough for Miss Marple to overhear while tending her roses with apparent casualness. The killer knew exactly where to stand for maximum effect. This wasn't a crime of passion, Constable. The formal interviews began in the vicarage drawing room, away from curious villagers, but not beyond Miss Marple's gentle observation. She had called to offer condolences and found herself invited to remain for moral support, a role she accepted with characteristic modesty. Victoria Ashford's account remained consistent with her previous statements, though Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled when describing the moments before Geoffrey's discovery. "My husband had many business interests," Victoria explained to Inspector Slack. "Some people disagreed with his methods, but Geoffrey was essentially harmless. He believed in progress, perhaps too enthusiastically for a place like St. Mary Mead." Her words carried conviction, yet Miss Marple detected something rehearsed in their delivery, as if Victoria had anticipated these questions and prepared appropriate responses. The first significant inconsistency emerged when Inspector Slack confronted Victoria with witness statements. Mrs. Price Ridley had observed Victoria leaving the preserve judging table at approximately 3:30, claiming she felt faint and needed fresh air. However, Margaret Haydock remembered seeing Victoria near the oak tree closer to 4 o'clock, well after the supposed recovery period and dangerously close to the time of Geoffrey's death. "I may have wandered about," Victoria admitted when confronted with this discrepancy. "The afternoon was quite overwhelming. I'm not entirely certain of my exact movements." Her explanation seemed reasonable enough for someone in shock, but Miss Marple noted how carefully Victoria avoided specific details that might be contradicted by other witnesses. Dennis Clement's interview proved equally revealing, though in different ways. His scholarly analysis of the murder weapon impressed Inspector Slack, who appreciated technical expertise from any source. "Academic curiosity," Dennis replied smoothly when questioned about his particular interest in the writing set. "I'm researching Victorian domestic artifacts for my thesis. The letter opener represented an excellent example of period craftsmanship." Miss Marple's attention drifted to the hall table where a small notebook lay open with neat columns of figures. Her eye, in passing, observed the heading, DBI Sale, Inventory, and the faint impression of a word rubbed out where a line had been amended. When she inquired gently about the writing set's donation, Reverend Clement's words tumbled over one another with nervous energy. "Clearing cupboards, you know. It's been sitting for ages. Dennis encouraged us to be thorough. He catalogued everything after breakfast." The vicar's flustered response suggested more complexity than simple spring cleaning, particularly when Miss Marple noticed Dennis positioning himself to observe Victoria's interview from the vicarage garden, his scholarly detachment replaced by obvious anxiety. Colonel Melchett's interview revealed the Preservation Society's collective motive with uncomfortable clarity. Geoffrey Ashford's interest in the old mill property had extended beyond simple development speculation. He had been pressuring elderly Mrs. Weatherby not merely to sell, but to accept terms significantly below market value, using tactics that bordered on intimidation without crossing into illegality. The Preservation Society met 3 times in the past month to discuss Ashford's activities, Colonel Melchett admitted reluctantly. Feelings ran quite high, I'm afraid. Several members expressed rather strong opinions about his methods. The colonel's military bearing couldn't entirely conceal his discomfort at potentially implicating fellow villagers in murder. Mrs. Price Ridley's interview provided the most dramatic moment of the morning. Geoffrey Ashford was a thoroughly unpleasant man, she declared without preamble. His business methods were despicable, his treatment of Mrs. Weatherby was shameful, and his development plans would have destroyed everything we've worked to preserve. However, she added with characteristic precision, I did not murder him, though I confess the thought had occurred to me. As afternoon shadows lengthened, Miss Marple found herself drawn to the Ashfords' rental house, where Victoria stood framed in the doorway like a portrait. The hall smelt faintly of lavender and something sharper beneath, nail varnish or furniture polish. On a side table lay a pair of leather driving gloves, the right glove bearing a dull smudge, as if briefly pressed against something that did not quite stain. I did not love Geoffrey as I once did, Victoria admitted with sudden frankness. I presume that will be held against me. Love seldom stays the same shape, Miss Marple replied gently. But loyalty wears more sizes than people think. As she prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused meaningfully. Do keep those gloves somewhere safe, my dear. In an emergency, one mislays the very thing one most needs. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind worked through the emerging pattern of deception and motive that surrounded Geoffrey Ashford's death. Near the tea tent, a thin, complaining squeak echoed Daisy Henderson's description of the sound she'd heard. Beneath the tent's flap, on trampled grass, a narrow ribbon of green showed where something had been dragged briefly and snatched up again. It was nothing at all, almost, and yet it was exactly the sort of nothing she had learned, long ago, to notice. The morning after Inspector Slack's arrival brought Miss Marple back to the festival grounds, where the abandoned stalls stood like monuments to interrupted normalcy. The green ribbon she had noticed beneath the tea tent the previous evening drew her attention once more, and she bent with apparent casualness to examine it more closely. The thin strand of leather, no wider than a bootlace, bore the faint impression of having been torn rather than cut, a detail that resonated with young Daisy Henderson's description of the peculiar squeaking sound. Miss Hartnell was dismantling the Women's Institute stall with methodical efficiency, her movements betraying the nervous energy that follows unexpected tragedy. Miss Marple approached with her customary gentleness, offering assistance while her sharp eyes catalogued the remaining items. The green leather writing set sat prominently displayed, conspicuously incomplete without its letter opener, a thin piece of string still dangling from where the weapon had once rested. Such a shame about the writing set, Miss Marple observed, running her fingers along the leather's smooth surface. Dennis seemed quite taken with it during his cataloguing. Oh, he was indeed. Miss Hartnell confirmed, pausing in her work. Very meticulous about everything. He even noted that the letter opener was underpriced for its quality. Said it was Victorian, quite valuable. She gestured toward the empty space in the set. The string was still there when I packed up after the commotion. Someone must have purchased it quickly, though I don't recall taking payment. Miss Marple's needles clicked thoughtfully as she examined the writing set more closely. When Miss Hartnell drew a blunt paper knife from the tight leather strap, it protested with precisely the squeaking sound that had caught Daisy's attention, a domestic, fussy little note that connected the child's observation to something far more sinister than playground discovery. Young Timothy Ashford appeared at Miss Marple's cottage gate that afternoon, his face bearing the strained expression of someone carrying burdens too heavy for 15 years. She invited him in with characteristic kindness, settling him in her sitting room with tea while encouraging him to share whatever had driven him to seek her counsel. "I keep thinking about things I saw," Timothy began hesitantly. "Mother received a note yesterday morning during breakfast. She tried to hide it, but I saw the top line. 'Under the oak, please.' She became very nervous afterward, asking Father about his plans, whether he intended to speak with anyone particular. His revelation carried implications that made Miss Marple's knitting needles pause momentarily. The boy continued with gathering confidence, as if sharing his burden lessened its weight. "There was something else. Last week I was out late with our terrier and saw Father arguing with Mr. Dennis near the post office. Father called him Little Scholar in a nasty way and said he'd shut up any talk at preservation meetings by buying the chairman if he had to. Mr. Dennis told him it wouldn't be money this time, it would be conscience." Meanwhile, Inspector Slack's interrogations had revealed significant inconsistencies in Victoria Ashford's account of her movements. Mrs. Price Ridley's sharp observation placed Victoria leaving the preserve judging table well before the murder, claiming faintness, yet Margaret Haydock remembered seeing her near the oak tree much closer to the fatal moment. When confronted with this discrepancy, Victoria's composed demeanor flickered slightly. "I may have wandered about," she admitted carefully. "The afternoon was quite overwhelming. I'm not entirely certain of my exact movements." Her explanation seemed reasonable enough for someone in shock, but Miss Marple detected something rehearsed in the precise way Victoria avoided specific details that might be contradicted by other witnesses. A visit to the vicarage revealed another crucial piece of the puzzle. In the study, Miss Marple examined the Women's Institute inventory ledger with the excuse of using the good window light. The neat columns of figures appeared straightforward, but careful examination revealed an erasure where "donated" had been written over another word. Using Sarah Clement's soft pencil, Miss Marple lightly shaded the area until ghostly letters emerged. Reserved. Dennis Clement entered the study with his habitual quickness, his scholarly composure slightly strained. "You're everywhere at once, Miss Marple," he said, smiling too quickly. "Thorough work, isn't it?" His glance toward the inventory carried more anxiety than casual interest. "Thoroughness is a form of charity," Miss Marple replied gently. "It spares people surprises. How good of you to have catalogued everything so carefully." The afternoon brought another significant revelation when Sarah Clement, overcome by the strain of keeping secrets, confessed to her father about witnessing crucial events. Her account, related to Miss Marple by a distraught Reverend Clement, provided essential details about the timeline. Sarah had observed Victoria's heated conversation with Geoffrey near the oak tree, their body language suggesting serious confrontation rather than casual marital discussion. Most significantly, she had also seen Dennis Clement approaching from the opposite direction, arriving just as the argument reached its climax. "I thought it was simply a disagreement about money or social obligations," Sarah explained through her tears. "I never imagined I was witnessing something so dreadful." Her innocence made the observation all the more credible, untainted by adult assumptions about motive and opportunity. As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple observed a quiet but tense exchange between Victoria Ashford and Dennis Clement in the vicarage garden. Their hushed conversation carried obvious urgency, Victoria's hand resting briefly on Dennis's arm in a gesture of intimacy that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Dennis appeared to be pleading with her, his usual confident demeanor replaced by haunted anxiety, while Victoria merely shook her head with weary resolve. Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind worked through the emerging pattern of deception that surrounded Geoffrey's death. The letter opener's journey from the Women's Institute stall, the squeaking sound of leather yielding its contents, Timothy's revelations about family tensions and secret notes, and the careful positioning required for the fatal wound, all suggested a meticulously planned crime rather than spontaneous violence. Somewhere among these carefully observed details lay the truth that patient observation would eventually reveal. The morning brought Miss Marple back to the Aitor festival grounds with renewed purpose, her keen eyes drawn once again to the abandoned stalls that stood like monuments to interrupted normalcy. The thin green ribbon she had noticed beneath the tea tent the previous evening deserved closer examination, and she bent with apparent casualness to study it more thoroughly. The narrow strand of leather bore the unmistakable impression of having been torn rather than cut, its frayed edges telling a story that resonated with young Daisy Henderson's peculiar description of squeaking sounds. Inspector Slack arrived shortly after dawn, his methodical nature evident as he supervised the careful documentation of physical evidence. Miss Marple approached him with characteristic diffidence, offering what appeared to be merely helpful household observations. "Leather can squeak most distinctively, Inspector," she mentioned mildly, "particularly when something is pulled from it against resistance, and chamois cloth. Well, chamois does make a very particular noise when rubbed against metal. It's what tidy people use for cleaning glassware and motor cars." The inspector's eyes narrowed with interest rather than skepticism. Dr. Haydock's earlier observation about the surprisingly clean murder weapon suddenly took on new significance when considered alongside these domestic details. Slack immediately examined the Women's Institute stall, where Miss Hartnell surrendered the green leather writing set with obvious relief. When he tested the strap that had once held the letter opener, it yielded with precisely the complaining squeak that had caught Daisy's attention, a household sound that transformed a child's innocent observation into crucial evidence. The formal interviews began at the vicarage, where Inspector Slack's methodical questioning revealed increasingly significant inconsistencies. Victoria Ashford's composed demeanor remained intact, but her account of movements during the critical period continued to shift under scrutiny. Multiple witnesses now placed her near the oak tree much closer to the time of Geoffrey's death than her claims of feeling faint would suggest. Mrs. Weatherby's testimony provided the investigation's most shocking revelation. The elderly woman arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, accompanied by her devoted companion, Miss Pritchard, both bearing the strained expressions of people carrying unbearable secrets. Mrs. Weatherby's trembling hands could barely manage her teacup as she described Geoffrey Ashford's increasingly threatening visits regarding the old mill property. He suggested that elderly people sometimes make poor decisions, Mrs. Weatherby whispered, and that concerned neighbors might need to intervene for my own protection. He was threatening to have me declared incompetent if I refused to sell. Her revelation cast Geoffrey's business practices in an even darker light, while simultaneously providing the Preservation Society with compelling motive for desperate action. Dennis Clement's scholarly composure began showing distinct cracks under official scrutiny. His detailed knowledge of the murder weapon's provenance, combined with witness accounts of his heated argument with Geoffrey near the post office, painted an increasingly suspicious picture. When Inspector Slack confronted him about the inventory ledger's erasure, where reserved had been written over and replaced with donated, Dennis's explanation came too smoothly, his foot betraying nervous energy through impatient tapping. The afternoon brought Timothy Ashford to Miss Marple's cottage. the boy's 15-year-old face bearing burdens too heavy for his years. His revelations about family dynamics provided crucial insight into the murder's deeper motivations. "Mother received a note yesterday morning during breakfast," he confided. "I saw the top line. Under the oak. Please." She became very nervous afterward, asking father about his plans. More significantly, Timothy described witnessing his father's confrontation with Dennis near the post office, where Jeffrey had called the young man "little scholar" in a nasty tone and threatened to buy the chairman if he had to silence Preservation Society opposition. Dennis's response, that it wouldn't be money this time, it would be conscience, suggested the conflict had escalated beyond mere disagreement about development plans. Sarah Clement's expanded testimony, provided through her distraught father, filled crucial gaps in the timeline. She had observed not only the heated argument between Victoria and Jeffrey beneath the oak tree, but also Dennis's approach from the opposite direction, arriving just as the confrontation reached its climax. Her innocent description of Victoria's hand slicing the air in vehement gesture, while Jeffrey produced a folded paper with a blue border, suggested the argument involved specific documentation rather than general marital discord. Dr. Haydick's continued examination of the crime scene revealed additional peculiarities about the wound pattern. "The angle suggests careful positioning rather than spontaneous violence," he explained to Inspector Slack. "It's almost as if the weapon was guided rather than thrust, the work of someone who knew exactly what they were doing." As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple observed a tense exchange between Victoria Ashford and Dennis Clement in the vicarage garden. Their hushed conversation carried obvious urgency, Victoria's hand resting briefly on Dennis's arm in a gesture of intimacy that seemed inappropriate given the circumstances. Dennis appeared to be pleading with her, his usual confident demeanor replaced by haunted anxiety, while Victoria merely shook her head with weary resolve. The day's final revelation came from Mrs. Burton at the post office, whose sharp observation provided another crucial piece of the emerging puzzle. "I saw young Mr. Dennis yesterday morning, very early, before the festival. Preparations began. He was near the oak tree, examining the ground quite carefully. When he noticed me watching, he waved and called out something about checking for rabbit holes before the children arrived." Walking home through the gathering dusk, Miss Marple's mind worked through the day's revelations like pieces of an intricate puzzle. The chamois cloth connection, the squeaking sound of leather yielding its contents, the carefully positioned scuff mark near the oak's roots, and Dennis's suspicious early morning presence at the crime scene all suggested meticulous planning rather than spontaneous violence. Yet beneath these methodical preparations lay deeper currents of desperation and protective instinct that transformed the crime from simple premeditation into something far more complex. The ancient oak stood sentinel over secrets that patient observation was slowly bringing to light, while somewhere among the village's carefully maintained facades, a killer waited for the next move in this deadly game of revelation and concealment. The morning brought Inspector Slack's investigation to a decisive point, his methodical nature now focused with laser precision on Dennis Clement. The young Oxford student sat in the vicarage drawing room, his scholarly composure beginning to show hairline cracks under official scrutiny. Miss Marple occupied her customary chair by the window, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her sharp eyes catalogued every subtle shift in the proceedings. "Your argument with Mr. Ashford was witnessed," Inspector Slack stated with characteristic directness. "Your early morning presence at the crime scene has been confirmed, and your particular interest in the murder weapon, reserving it rather than simply cataloguing it for the sale, suggests premeditation rather than scholarly curiosity." Dennis's foot began tapping against the carpet with nervous energy, his usual confident demeanor faltering under the weight of accumulating evidence. The morning's most significant revelation came from Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, where Miss Pritchard had made a disturbing discovery while organizing her employer's papers. Hidden beneath a stack of gardening magazines lay a folder containing property documents bearing what appeared to be Mrs. Weatherby's signature, though the elderly woman vehemently denied any knowledge of signing such papers. The handwriting was remarkably similar to her own, yet something indefinably wrong suggested careful forgery rather than authentic documentation. Geoffrey Ashford was systematically defrauding Mrs. Weatherby, Dennis declared with sudden vehemence, his academic detachment finally cracking completely. What he was doing to that poor old woman was criminal, even if technically legal. Someone had to stop him before he destroyed her completely. His passionate defense revealed depths of moral conviction that transformed him from mere scholarly observer to potential vigilante, acting from protective instinct rather than personal malice. Victoria Ashford's reaction to news of the forged documents provided the investigation's most startling moment. Rather than shock or disbelief, her face showed unmistakable relief, as if a terrible burden had been lifted from her shoulders. "I suspected something like this," she admitted to Inspector Slack with newfound frankness. Geoffrey had been working late into the night, practicing signatures. He claimed it was for business correspondence, but I recognized Mrs. Weatherby's distinctive handwriting from her thank-you notes. This admission transformed Victoria from grieving widow to potential accomplice or whistleblower, depending on her ultimate actions during the crucial moments beneath the oak tree. The note Timothy had observed, "under the oak," "please," suddenly suggested a planned confrontation about Geoffrey's fraudulent activities rather than any romantic assignation. Young Timothy's arrival at the vicarage that afternoon brought the investigation's most crucial revelation. The boy's 15-year-old face bore the strain of carrying secrets too heavy for his years, and his whispered confession to Reverend Clement carried through the study's open window to Miss Marple's attentive ears. "I saw Mother cleaning her driving gloves yesterday morning," he revealed with obvious distress. "She was using that special chamois cloth she keeps for the motor car, but there was something dark on the gloves and she was crying while she cleaned them." Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly as this observation connected directly to Dr. Haydock's puzzlement about the murder weapon's pristine condition. Someone had carefully cleaned the letter opener after the fatal blow, using chamois cloth that would leave no fibers but would produce the distinctive squeaking sound that had caught Daisy Henderson's attention. The killer had been methodical enough to clean the weapon thoroughly, but human enough to weep while performing this grim necessity. Yet something about the case against Dennis troubled Miss Marple's experienced instincts. The evidence fitted together with almost suspicious neatness, creating a picture that seemed too perfect, too convenient for genuine guilt. She had observed over many years that real crimes rarely arranged themselves with such tidy precision. True guilt usually left messier traces, more contradictory evidence, fewer perfectly aligned circumstances. The afternoon brought another significant observation when Miss Marple encountered Victoria and Dennis in heated conversation beside the vicarage garden gate. Their hushed exchange carried obvious urgency, with Dennis appearing to plead desperately, while Victoria shook her head with weary resignation. "You don't understand the implications," Dennis whispered, his voice carrying faintly on the autumn breeze. "If they discover the truth, everything we've worked for becomes meaningless." Victoria's response was barely audible, but Miss Marple's sharp hearing caught the essential words. "It's too late for protection now. The choice was made beneath the oak tree, and we must live with the consequences." Their shared secret bound them in a web of mutual dependence that suggested complicity in something far more complex than simple murder. As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple reflected on the day's revelations while taking her customary walk through the village. The forged documents revealed the true scope of Geoffrey's criminal intentions, transforming his death from domestic tragedy to desperate intervention. Yet the careful cleaning of the murder weapon suggested someone acting from moral conviction rather than personal hatred, someone who wept while performing necessary but distasteful actions. The ancient oak stood sentinel over secrets that were slowly surfacing, its massive trunk bearing witness to the complex interplay of justice and desperation that had culminated in Geoffrey Ashford's death. Miss Marple paused beneath its spreading branches, her mind working through the intricate pattern of evidence and motive that surrounded this most unusual crime. Somewhere among the village's carefully maintained facades, the complete truth waited for patient observation to reveal its devastating and unexpected face. The investigation was approaching its climax, yet Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations still lay hidden beneath layers of protective deception and misguided loyalty. The real killer remained concealed behind the obvious suspect, protected by circumstances that made guilt appear to rest elsewhere, while truth waited for the proper moment to emerge from shadow into light. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the vicarage with the brisk determination of a man ready to conclude an increasingly complex case. Dennis Clement sat rigidly in the drawing-room chair, his scholarly composure now threadbare under the weight of accumulating evidence. His nervous foot-tapping had become almost constant, betraying the anxiety that his carefully controlled expression attempted to conceal. Miss Marple occupied her customary position by the window, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her sharp eyes observed every subtle nuance of the proceedings. "I am prepared to make an arrest," Inspector Slack announced with characteristic directness, his notebook containing what appeared to be a comprehensive case against the young Oxford student. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Dennis's documented antagonism toward Geoffrey Ashford, his suspicious early morning presence at the crime scene, his particular interest in reserving the murder weapon, and the damning alteration in the inventory ledger. Yet something in Miss Marple's expression suggested she found this neat conclusion unsatisfactory. "Inspector," she said with gentle diffidence, "might you postpone that decision until after tea? I've observed that people often feel compelled to tidy before unpleasant visitors arrive. It's a curious habit with sometimes revealing consequences." Her mild tone carried an authority that made Slack pause despite his eagerness to close the case. The inspector's experience had taught him that panicked housekeeping often eliminated more than dust, and Miss Marple's reputation for unconventional insights deserved consideration. 2 hours. Slack agreed reluctantly. "Then we proceed with the arrest." Dennis stared at Miss Marple with something approaching desperate hope, while Reverend Clement hovered uncertainly near the doorway, clearly overwhelmed by the morning's developments. Miss Marple's first destination was Mrs. Weatherby's cottage, where Miss Pritchard greeted her with the relief of someone expecting storm clouds but finding shelter instead. "A lady came after dark last evening," Miss Pritchard confided before tea was properly served. "Well-dressed, soft-voiced, claiming she wanted to reassure us about the property documents. She asked to examine the papers again, said she feared they might go missing in all the confusion." Mrs. Weatherby nodded with trembling hands, her frail voice barely audible. "There was something about her manner, Miss Marple. So composed, yet underneath I sensed terrible agitation, and a faint scent. Lavender mixed with something sharper, almost chemical." The description resonated with Miss Marple's memory of Victoria's pristine hall and the small bottle of quick-drying varnish she had noticed on the side table. From the lane, Miss Marple observed thin smoke curling from the Ashfords' kitchen window, not the comfortable smoke of a cooking fire, but the acrid plume that belongs to burning paper rather than coal or wood. She arrived to find Margaret Haydock beating out the last flames in a waste paper basket with a damp tea towel, while Victoria stood frozen with the rigid posture of someone fighting complete collapse. "A small accident," Margaret announced with medical briskness, a cigarette end in the basket, nothing more serious. Yet Victoria's eyes avoided both women's gazes, and Miss Marple noticed scorched fragments on the hearth, pale board edged in blue and a twist of yellow leather fused beyond recognition. The air carried lavender and an unmistakably acrid tang that spoke of destroyed evidence rather than domestic mishap. Young Timothy appeared in the doorway at that crucial moment, clutching a partially burned envelope with obvious distress. "Mother threw this away," he whispered miserably. "I rescued it from the scuttle before the fire caught everything." The note, when unfolded, revealed the message that had haunted the investigation. "Under the oak, please." The paper bore a faint pressed border of tiny acorns and a grease shadow where a gloved thumb had rested during anxious handling. Inspector Slack, summoned by Margaret's urgent bicycle ride, examined the evidence with growing interest. "Vicarage stationery," he observed grimly, recognizing the distinctive acorn border from parish correspondence. "So our scholar arranges the meeting, and you attend in your husband's place." His accusatory tone made Victoria's carefully maintained composure waver visibly. "I wrote no such note," Victoria replied with desperate precision. "I found it on the breakfast tray that morning. Someone wanted Geoffrey to meet them beneath the oak tree." Her explanation carried the ring of truth, yet her obvious anxiety about the burned evidence suggested deeper involvement than simple message delivery. Miss Marple's afternoon visit to Victoria revealed the psychological pressure that was building toward inevitable revelation. She approached the subject with characteristic indirection, mentioning the peculiar squeaking sound that had caught young Daisy's attention. "It reminded me of cleaning silver," she observed mildly, "or perhaps polishing a motor car with chamois cloth. Such a distinctive noise." Victoria's reaction was immediate and telling. Her hands, which had been steadily arranging autumn flowers, froze mid-gesture. Her faint tremor ran through her fingers, and barely perceptible pallor spread across her carefully composed features. Her gaze flickered toward the fireplace, then back to Miss Marple, with a fleeting expression that revealed sudden recognition and poorly concealed fear. "A squeaking sound," Victoria repeated, her voice pitched slightly higher than usual. "How very odd. One hears all sorts of noises at festivals, doesn't one? Children and their imaginations." The forced smile that accompanied these words failed to reach her eyes, and a muscle in her jaw betrayed the tension she was fighting to control. As evening shadows lengthened, Miss Marple observed Dennis leaving the Ashford residence with his face etched in familiar anxiety. Victoria stood at the doorway, her hand briefly touching his arm in a gesture of quiet understanding that spoke of shared secrets and mutual dependence. No words were exchanged, but the unspoken communication was unmistakable, a protective alliance forged in desperation, with Dennis serving as shield rather than perpetrator. The investigation was approaching its climax, yet Miss Marple sensed that the most crucial revelations still lay hidden beneath layers of misguided loyalty and desperate protection. The truth would emerge, as truth always did, but it would require careful handling to prevent further tragedy from compounding the original crime. Inspector Slack returned to the vicarage with the determined stride of a man ready to conclude an increasingly complex case, his arrest warrant tucked securely in his breast pocket. The agreed postponement had expired, and Dennis Clement sat rigidly in the drawing-room chair, his scholarly composure now threadbare under the weight of accumulating evidence. Miss Marple occupied her customary position by the window, her knitting needles maintaining their gentle rhythm while her sharp eyes observed every subtle nuance of the gathering storm. "I believe we should examine one small detail before proceeding," Miss Marple said with characteristic mildness, her voice carrying the quiet authority that made even Inspector Slack pause despite his eagerness. "Young Daisy Henderson heard that distinctive squeaking sound at precisely the moment she discovered Mr. Ashford's body. Yet if the murder weapon had already been used and abandoned, what was being cleaned with chamois cloth at that crucial moment?" Her question hung in the air like a challenge, drawing sharp attention from everyone present. Victoria Ashford, summoned as a witness, sat with carefully controlled composure, though Miss Marple noticed how her hands trembled almost imperceptibly when the chamois cloth was mentioned. Dennis straightened in his chair with dawning comprehension, while Inspector Slack's pen paused above his notebook. The forged documents that so troubled Mrs. Weatherby required considerable artistic skill, Miss Marple continued with patient precision. Geoffrey Ashford possessed neither the steady hand nor the artistic ability necessary for such delicate work. Someone else prepared those fraudulent papers, someone with the patience and precision that forgery demands. She paused to examine her knitting, allowing the implications to settle. Someone, perhaps, with experience in careful penmanship and attention to detail. Victoria's carefully maintained facade began showing hairline cracks. Her breathing became slightly more rapid, and a muscle in her jaw betrayed the tension she was fighting to control. Dennis immediately shifted closer, his protective instincts overriding concern for his own precarious position. The note arranging the meeting beneath the oak tree presents another curious detail, Miss Marple observed gently. Young Timothy has been carrying a terrible burden, believing himself responsible for his father's death. She turned to address the boy directly, her voice filled with compassionate understanding. You wrote that note, didn't you, dear? Hoping to arrange a reconciliation between your parents in a public place where harsh words might be avoided. Timothy, who had been hovering uncertainly in the doorway, stepped forward with tears streaming down his 15-year-old face. I thought if they talked somewhere, people could see them, Father would behave properly, he whispered. I left it on the breakfast tray, but Mother found it first. She tried to protect me by putting it back in Father's pocket when she kissed him goodbye. Victoria's composure finally shattered completely. Stop, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Please just stop. Her hands covered her face as her shoulders shook with suppressed emotion that had been building for days. The careful mask she had worn since Geoffrey's death crumbled, revealing the exhausted, terrified woman beneath. You discovered Dennis's moral outrage about the forged documents, Miss Marple continued with gentle firmness, and realized he might expose Geoffrey's criminal activities. But you couldn't let that happen because you were the one who had prepared those fraudulent papers. Geoffrey had coerced you into using your artistic skills, threatening to implicate you while claiming ignorance if the scheme was discovered. Dennis moved protectively to Victoria's side, his face bearing the expression of someone whose worst fears were finally being confirmed. She was trapped, he said quietly. Geoffrey threatened to have her arrested for forgery while he walked away free. She felt completely helpless. The confrontation beneath the oak tree became violent when Geoffrey refused to end the scheme, Miss Marple observed sadly. In the struggle, Victoria managed to wound him with the letter opener she had taken from the Women's Institute stall. The weapon was cleaned afterward with chamois cloth, creating the squeaking sound that caught young Daisy's attention. Victoria raised her tear-streaked face, her voice steadier now that the truth was emerging. He said he would claim I'd tried to kill him for his money, that everyone would believe the successful businessman over the greedy wife. Even wounded, he was still manipulating, still threatening to destroy me completely. But the wound, while serious, was not immediately fatal, Miss Marple continued with compassionate understanding. What happened next demonstrates the tragic complexity of human loyalty. Dennis arrived in response to Timothy's note, hoping to prevent the confrontation entirely. He found Victoria in shock beside Geoffrey, who was still conscious and still making threats about having her hanged for attempted murder. The room fell into profound silence as the full tragedy became clear. Inspector Slack closed his notebook with a heavy sigh, understanding that justice in this case would be far more complex than simple arrest and trial. Two people, acting from love and desperation rather than malice, had become entangled in circumstances that transformed justified resistance into something far more serious. The chamois cloth, Miss Marple concluded gently, was used to clean the weapon after ensuring Geoffrey could make no more threats. It was an act born of protective love rather than personal hatred, completing something that desperation had begun. She looked around the room with infinite sadness. Sometimes the greatest tragedies arise not from evil intentions, but from good people pushed beyond their limits by circumstances they never chose. As evening shadows lengthened over St. Mary Mead, the ancient oak stood witness to the revelations of secrets it had harbored beneath its spreading branches. The truth, as it always did, had finally emerged from the careful observations of human nature that Miss Marple had spent a lifetime perfecting, leaving everyone forever chained by the complex web of love, desperation, and protective instinct that had culminated in Geoffrey Ashford's death. The silence that followed Miss Marple's devastating reconstruction hung like morning mist over the vicarage drawing room, each person processing the complex web of truth that had finally been exposed. Inspector Slack sat with his arrest warrant forgotten, grappling with moral complexities that transformed simple murder into something far more nuanced. Victoria Ashford's carefully maintained composure had finally shattered completely, tears of relief mingling with terror of consequences she could no longer avoid. "Perhaps we should complete this beneath the oak tree," Miss Marple suggested with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying the quiet authority that made even Inspector Slack pause despite his professional urgency. Truth often emerges more clearly where it was first concealed. Her mild tone disguised the psychological strategy of returning suspects to the scene where their carefully constructed defenses might finally crumble completely. They walked in subdued procession across the festival grounds, where abandoned stalls stood like monuments to interrupted normalcy. The ancient oak presided over the gathering with silent dignity, its massive trunk bearing witness to secrets that patient observation had slowly brought to light. Miss Marple positioned herself where the telltale scuff mark had been discovered, her sharp eyes cataloguing every subtle reaction from the assembled group. "The sequence of events matters greatly for justice," she began with gentle firmness, her knitting needles clicking softly as she organized the final pieces of this tragic puzzle. Victoria wounded Geoffrey during their struggle beneath these branches, but the injury, while serious, would not have proven immediately fatal with proper medical attention. Geoffrey remained conscious and continued making threats about having her arrested for attempted murder while claiming complete innocence himself. Victoria's voice emerged as barely a whisper, her words carrying the weight of unbearable secrets finally released. "He said no one would believe me over him. Even wounded, he was still manipulating the situation, threatening to have me hanged while he played the innocent victim of a jealous wife's violence." Her confession carried the ring of truth that comes from exhausted honesty rather than calculated deception. Dennis stepped protectively closer, his scholarly composure replaced by haunted anxiety. When I arrived in response to Timothy's note, hoping to prevent any confrontation entirely, I found them struggling. Geoffrey was still conscious, still making those terrible threats about destroying Victoria completely. His voice cracked with the weight of decisions made in desperate moments when time allowed no careful consideration of consequences. Miss Marple's needles paused almost imperceptibly as she addressed the heart of the tragedy. The letter opener remained embedded in Geoffrey's chest, but the wound was not necessarily fatal. Dennis faced an impossible choice: summon help and watch Victoria face charges based on Geoffrey's inevitable lies, or ensure that Geoffrey's threats died with him. Love makes people capable of actions they never imagined possible. Timothy, who had been listening with the strained attention of someone whose world had become incomprehensible, suddenly stepped forward. "It's entirely my fault," he whispered, his 15-year-old voice breaking. "If I hadn't written that note trying to bring them together, none of this would have happened." His innocent guilt provided the most heartbreaking element of the entire tragedy. "Oh, my dear boy," Miss Marple replied with infinite compassion, "you must never accept responsibility for adult choices made in desperate circumstances. Your note was written from love, hoping to heal rather than harm. The tragedy arose from your father's criminal activities and threats, not from your innocent attempt at family reconciliation." Inspector Slack struggled visibly with the legal implications of what he was hearing. Two people acting from desperation and protective love rather than malice. their crime born of circumstances that transcended simple legal categories. "The law cannot ignore what has been done, regardless of motivation," he said finally, his voice heavy with necessary duty. "However, circumstances matter greatly in determining appropriate charges and potential sentences." Dr. Haydock, who had arrived during the proceedings, confirmed Miss Marple's reconstruction with medical precision. The initial wound would have been survivable with prompt treatment. The fatal damage occurred when the weapon was deliberately repositioned, ensuring that threats and manipulation would end permanently. His clinical assessment provided the technical foundation for understanding the crime's complex nature. The chamois cloth was used afterward to clean the weapon thoroughly, Miss Marple continued, her voice filled with infinite sadness for the tragedy that good intentions had created. The squeaking sound that caught young Daisy's attention came from this methodical cleaning, performed with tears rather than callousness. It was the sound of desperate people trying to erase evidence of actions they never wanted to take. As autumn twilight settled over St. Mary Mead, the investigation reached its melancholy conclusion. Victoria and Dennis accepted their fate with quiet dignity, their shared burden creating bonds that would endure whatever legal consequences awaited. The Preservation Society members, once united in opposition to Jeffrey's development plans, now grappled with the disturbing realization of the lengths to which desperation had driven their cause. Miss Marple gathered her knitting with characteristic precision, her role in revealing truth now complete. Walking home through the gathering darkness, she reflected on the eternal complexities of human nature that made some people capable of both great love and terrible necessity. The ancient oak would continue standing sentinel over St. Mary Mead, its spreading branches witness to the tragedy that had shattered the village's peaceful surface, while revealing the depths of loyalty and desperation that existed beneath carefully maintained facades. Evil had been stopped, though at costs that would resonate through many lives for years to come. Justice would take its course, but understanding had been achieved through patient observation of the small details that revealed larger truths about the human heart.